everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Libby Smith, the Director of Advocacy at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I'm thrilled to be chairing today's event on how the UK can help to protect religious freedoms around the world. We have a brilliant lineup of speakers today who have each done so much to shine a spotlight on religious persecution and work tirelessly to champion the rights of freedom of religion and belief around the world. I'll start by telling you a bit about the Coalition, and then we'll hear from each of our panel of experts, and finally we will open it up to audience questions. So the Coalition for Global Prosperity was set up 3 years ago because we believe that Britain is at its best when it acts as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective development budget alongside our defence and diplomatic programmes really can and does transform lives across the world. This has been proven time and time again. Our development leadership and the excellent work of British diplomats sends a clear message about our values as a country, one of tolerance and compassion, flying the flag for democracy, the rule of law and human rights globally. This is why Britain must continue to stand up for the rights of individuals to practice their faith and belief openly and freely around the world. However, unfortunately, religious persecution is on the rise. I was shocked to hear that 56 nations, that's more than a quarter of the world's countries, currently impose high or very high restrictions on religious freedom, with North Korea, China and Iran among the worst oppressors. Religious liberty truly is the first freedom. If a government is unwilling to respect freedom of religion, it is unlikely to respect political dissent and civil liberties. Moreover, societies with intense hostility towards other religious faiths are likely to become incubators of other intolerances and instabilities, which can spill over and make us all less safe. However, whilst these practical concerns are important, fundamentally, standing up for religious freedom around the world is the right thing to do. We have a moral imperative to act on this. So as the UK redefines its role in the world, we have the opportunity to really consider what sort of nation do we want to be. Standing up for and defending freedom of religious belief must be top of the agenda. So in today's event, we will be exploring questions such as, how has the pandemic impacted religious freedom around the world? What is the UK's strongest tools in promoting religious freedom abroad? And what implications does promoting religious freedom around the world have for us domestically in the UK? And you will also have the opportunity to ask your questions. So throughout the event, do click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and type out your name, your organisation and your question. And I'll try and get through as many of these as we possibly can. However, first, I'm going to hand over to our fantastic panel for their opening remarks. First, we have Uzma Hussain, who is joining us directly from Pakistan today. Uzma is a project manager at an international conflict resolution NGO called Search for Common Ground. They work on religious freedom in some of the most challenging contexts, including in Pakistan, Iraq, in Sri Lanka, and Uzma works with communities, religious leaders, women and youth groups to promote religious freedom in Pakistan. So have some real valuable first-hand experience on this. So Uzma, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'll hand over to you. Oh, Uzma, I think we can't hear you at the moment. I don't know if your microphone is perhaps not on. Why don't we go? We can go to Saqib Bhatti and then we'll come back to you, Uzma, so you have some time to sort out your microphone. So Saqib Bhatti MP is the MP, Conservative MP for Meriden. In 2019, he was elected, having previously been the youngest ever president of the Greater Birmingham Chamber of Commerce. Saqib has spoken out on freedom of religion in Parliament multiple times and is a part of the all-party parliamentary group on international freedom of religion or belief. So Saqib, I'll come to you first while Uzma works at her microphone.
Thank you very much, Libby. And can I just say your words really resonated, because I will speak about freedom of religion and why it's important, but you're right, it's the right thing to do to fight for it, and there is a moral imperative, and it really goes right to the heart of who we are as a nation, and hopefully through my remarks that comes through. Look, freedom is something that, it's a word that we've been speaking about a lot in the UK over the last few weeks and last few months. And like me, you may have enjoyed a highly anticipated Freedom Day. And of course, at the end of lockdown, this was a significant moment for so many. And however, around the world, we can find countless instances of men, women, and children who are robbed of the most basic freedoms with no roadmap or no exit strategy in sight like we had. In fact, one of the most challenging aspects of COVID that I found in the UK was the closure of places of worship, particularly for people of faith during their holiest times, such as during Easter or Ramadan or Passover or Eid and Diwali. And the loss of congregation is really devastating for so many communities and so many people. And as a man of faith myself, it really brought into sharp focus what life must be like for those who are never allowed to practice their faith in public or in private. And it's an unfortunate fact that in the 21st century, having the basic right to go and practice your religion freely is still not a freely given right in certain parts of the world. And I will come on to particular groups in a moment. I think it's obvious to say this, but it's worth stating, like you said, having religious freedom within a society, and that includes the right not to practice a religion if that's what you desire, is an example of a mature and developed society. And often the lack of religious freedom can be emblematic of the ruling class's attitudes to other freedoms, such as the right to protest or civil liberties. And examples of persecuted religious minorities from across the world include people like the Baha'i people in Iran, who have faced a cradle-to-grave situation of persecution because the Iranian constitution provides a framework for the terror that they experience. Or more recently, even the persecution of the Yazidi people that has been ongoing for centuries and still demonstrates no sign of letting up, most recently at the hands of ISIS. And of course, we saw the restriction of other liberties for many other people in society. We also see the suffering of Christian communities in the Middle East, or that suffering experienced by Muslims in Bosnia, where even a NATO intervention wasn't able to stop a genocide that was being carried out only as recently as the 1990s. And I think for me, it really beggars belief that there continues to be such profound horrors experienced by so many people in the 21st century. And certainly looking to all options to prevent and mitigate these disasters should be explored, and we should do everything we can to achieve something in this field. In a world where we have new top economic superpowers that are set to be even more religiously diverse than we've known in the past, there really is no place for religious intolerance. And we must ensure that we are proactive in supporting all religious communities across the globe to be free to practice whatever faith they wish in peace. For me, the most impactful way to move forward on this issue, and for us as parliamentarians, is to ensure that the international community works together and in a coordinated way helps to promote religious freedoms across the world. An essential part of this, as a nation, Britain must be, and it is, a global leader in promoting religious freedoms across the world. And in a world where reversion to populism and protectionism is often seen as a safe corner for so many, it is Britain that can lead the way, working with its international partners to promote the journey of human rights and universal acceptance of religious freedoms. And one final point I'll make is really about the role of business, because I often speak about business being a force for good. I did it as a president of the Chambers of Commerce, and I continue to do so. Well, in this case, business must be a force for good. Ultimately, companies have a responsibility to make sure that their supply chains are clean. And if there is a risk of slave labor being used or persecuted minorities being part of those supply chains, those companies must take corrective actions. And of course, I'm particularly referring to some of the stories we hear coming out of China and the Uyghur communities, but I'm sure there's many other instances. Finally, I'd just like to say, often I get asked about my journey as a new parliamentarian, what I'd like to achieve, what is, you come in at this exciting time, what's the big picture? Well, wouldn't it be great if we could make persecution of religious communities across the world a thing of the past, and let that be our legacy for the 21st century? Thank you.
Thanks, Saqib, for those really powerful opening remarks. Uzma, I'm going to try and come back to you now and see if your audio is connected.
Hello, am I hearable?
Oh, perfect. Yeah, it wouldn't be a Zoom event without at least one technical glitch. We can hear you great, Uzma. Go ahead.
Thank you, Saqib. Thank you, Saqib Bhatti. As a searcher, I do not only believe in your suggestions, but from our experience of working around the world, I can confirm that it is possible, and it is possible when we work with a hope. And by working in 40 countries from more than 30 years, we learn that if we open up ourselves as individuals, as communities, and as nation for collaboration, we can achieve freedom, justice, and peace. Searchers is working around the world to transform the way world deal with conflict. And here I would like to highlight the word world, because we cannot separate any single community or group of people on basis of their ideologies and continue our work with like-minded people and then pretend to ourselves that by doing this we can achieve freedom and peace easily. Unfortunately, like many countries, Pakistan is on the same track where legislators pass laws under pressures of faith leaders and make amendments in the laws after they receive pressures from other nations, or they take inspiration from other nations. We found that both sides are enabled, both the government and the faith leader sides are unable to understand each other's perspective because of absence of platforms to have dialogues, and we believe that we also found that both sides believe that by adopting adversarial approach and violent mean, they can win the side which shows more violence, roadblocks, and pressurize each other. The side can win. In this situation in Pakistan, searchers are trying to bridge among faith actors, government, and civil society to help them understand that instead of approaching conflict from a win or lose perspective, we can approach it with a win and with a win-win approach. And we are aware that we targeted government leaders and high-level government leaders, parliamentarians, and faith leaders, and we are aware of the fact that we are a very small team as Search for Pakistan, Search for Common Ground Pakistan team, and to increase our impact, because it is very necessary. We found it very necessary that we approach more faith leaders and more parliamentarians. So to do that, and by checking our fact, we are increasing our team by empowering young people across Sindh and Punjab sides of Pakistan by building their capacity so they can work directly with faith leaders, government, and civil society organizations to promote freedom and religion and belief.
Thanks, Uzma, for those fantastic opening remarks and setting the scene for us of what you're working on in Pakistan itself. Next up, we have Dr. David Landrum, who Dr. Landrum is the Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs at Open Doors UK, which, for those who don't know, is a brilliant organisation fighting against the persecution of Christians around the world. So, David, over to you.
Thank you, Libby, and thanks for the introduction. I could say no more than I completely agree with you and the two contributors that have gone before me. But just to address the main question, how can the UK help religious freedoms around the world? How can it protect them? I think it can protect them best by promoting them, by making religious freedom a policy goal of the UK government going forward as we find our place in the world. It's widely acknowledged that freedom of religion underpins, extends, informs, supports a whole range of other human rights and civil liberties, such as freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the rights of family. And this is why the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Williams, called it the litmus test for democracy. So if we really value free societies and democracy, a great way to promote that, in a practical way to promote that, is to prioritize religious freedom, the promotion and protection of religious freedom around the world. I think the UK has done a lot. It's moving in the right direction on this. Practically, the appointment of Fiona Bruce MP as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief is a fantastic appointment. The Truro report being assessed quite soon is a great innovation to get the Foreign Office focused on it. And next July, we have the opportunity to really emphasize our commitment to freedom of religion or belief with the international ministerial coming to London, which is a huge opportunity for the UK, I think, going forward. I would like to see us hold other governments to account for their convention commitments, and I would also like to see us do that by incorporating human rights and freedom of religion into our trade negotiations and trade deals. At least in the negotiations themselves, there are all sorts of mechanisms and options for building them into the deals themselves as well. In terms of the value this brings on the ground, we work in over 60 countries. The role of local faith-based actors is absolutely incredibly powerful and surpasses NGOs and what governments can do quite often in terms of alleviating poverty, responding to crises, conflict resolution, gender issues, community development, education, and more generally, I do think that religious freedom, as it brings religious flourishing, is probably the strongest factor we have to contribute towards building civil society. And I think we all want that. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and for raising the important point of how we can incorporate this into trade deals, which I'm sure we'll get onto later on in the event. Next up for opening remarks, we have Fleur Anderson MP. Fleur became the Labour Member of Parliament for Putney in 2019, initially becoming involved in politics when campaigning against the council's decision to close a local children's centre. Prior to Parliament, Fleur had a career spanning 25 years in international development, including heading up Christian Aid's Bosnia office in the aftermath of the Bosnia War, heading up the campaigns team at CAFOD, and as head of global campaigns at War Trade, where we work together. And so significant experience on this issue. So Fleur, over to you.
Thanks very much, Libby, and thanks to the Coalition for putting on this very timely meeting, really. And I absolutely agree with the remarks gone before about the importance of countering and protecting religious freedom and countering discrimination, and that being not just about religious freedom in its own right, but what a litmus test it is, or how much it joins up with other freedoms as well, and it joins up with poverty reduction as well. We can't achieve our poverty reduction goals, and that's also linked to climate change. So it's part of the big issues of the day, and I think COVID has had a huge impact on religious freedom and an increase in discrimination, which I'm sure we'll be coming on to. But thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm the chair of the APPG on genocide and crimes against humanity, and I'm a member of the APPG of the Ahmadiyya community, and for the APPG for the International Freedom of Religion and Belief. And I think APPGs and all party parliamentary groups are a very important part of this discussion, and some places which are having a real impact at the moment. As you said, Libby, I've worked in Bosnia for Christian Aid, and I've led the office there during the war and then afterwards in the rebuilding. So I saw for myself how quickly religious persecution can slide into genocide and war and split communities apart, and how a community that can be living side by side with different religions and ethnicity that can all crumble so easily. And so how important it is to build peace all the time, and building the ability to practice your religion with total freedom is such an important part of peace as well. And then if you don't have peace, you can't also combat poverty, and so it goes back into that circle again. But one religious group that I would like to focus on is the Ahmadiyya community. So Southfields is in my constituency, and it's home to one of the largest Ahmadiyya communities in the UK, and the famous Fazl Mosque. It's a beautiful mosque that was built with donations from Indian women in 1926, and a lovely testament, I think, of one community across the world helping religious freedom of another community here in the UK, and a tradition which I hope we do continue. But the Ahmadis, as Uzma will know very much, in Pakistan have faced violent persecution for decades. And that the anti-Ahmadi Muslim sentiment is as strong and violent as ever. And I hear very frequently from constituents in Southfields about the impact on their daily lives, but also their friends and relatives in Pakistan. There have been murders of the Ahmadi community in May 2010, 2 Ahmadi Muslim mosques in Lahore were attacked and 80 Ahmadis were massacred. But it's gone on beyond violence as well to the everyday lives of voting, of getting married, of receiving literature. It just affects every part of the Ahmadi community's life. The Ahmadi Muslims have been denied their right to vote in Pakistan, and their core religious texts and websites are still banned. The court even recently ruled in 2018 that to be removed from all senior positions in the civil service and armed forces of the Ahmadi community. It's severely restrictive discrimination. I've had constituents coming to me even recently now saying that they are not able to get the right to remain here in this country for their spouses because their marriage certificates issued in Pakistan are not recognised by the Pakistani authorities because they're from the Ahmadiyya religion. So this is just one example of the religious persecution that exists today. But the question for today is, what can the UK do? And I've got a little list of things that I think we can do as parliamentarians. And I'm an opposition parliamentarian, so I have less power that Saqib has. But there are things we can certainly do. I mean, I saw it for myself when I was in Bosnia that when different countries, governments issued statements, had debates, said about the issues that we were facing in Bosnia, what a difference it made. It really was very encouraging at many times that someone had got our back in another country. So I can see the impact that it has. So first of all is all party parliamentary groups, as I've mentioned. I would recommend anyone to read the Ahmadiyya community report that's been done by the Ahmadiyya all party parliamentary group with some really powerful recommendations that have had a big impact. I've got a lot of media coverage and a lot of impact both in Pakistan and here. Another opportunity is legislation. Legislation offers many different avenues that we can use far more than we do. And it's been mentioned about the trade bill, where a new clause would have allowed the High Court to determine whether or not a signatory to trade deals was perpetuating genocide. It was within a whisker of passing. It was so close. It was really good that we had that debate and it was there in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but it didn't pass. And I was very disappointed about that, but I hope that it was a marker that this must become part of our trade negotiations in the future. Another avenue is debates in the House of Commons. So in April, history was made, and I was there when in the House of Commons, we declared for the first time that genocide is taking place against the Uyghurs. There's a very, very high level of proof needed to declare a genocide, and unfairly so. I think that the system is rigged against declaring a genocide when it's most needed to be declared. So to stand up for the Uyghur people in the House of Commons and make that vote, I think was very significant. Not binding, but significant. Another means is diplomatic means. So speaking to our diplomats, being able to talk to those people who are on behalf of Britain, are talking with diplomats in the other countries and with our high commissions and ambassadors. And then a final way of a tool that we can use is places like the Winter Olympics, so that we will only go and stand up there in the Winter Olympics and add our state support for this event if the issue of the Uyghurs is taken seriously, and we can use that opportunity. And I think we should be using all of these and more as much as we can, because I think that it's really critical that we work cross-party on this. And whether you're left or right of the political spectrum, we all share a resolute desire for a world where human beings can practice and express their faith tradition and their beliefs freely without any threat of reprisal and violence. And such a world is possible, but if we work together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fleur, for those brilliant opening remarks and some really clear steps it can take there. Lastly, we have Brenden Thompson, who is the CEO of Catholic Voices and a trustee of the Bible Society. Brenden is a regular voice on TV and radio, speaking about the importance of freedom of religion. So, Brenden, over to you.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here. And I guess my interest in this topic will come from that background in media and communication. What's the power of language, ideas, and communication in promoting and defending religious freedom? And I'm minded when I thought about the kind of what you might call polite persecution that goes on here in the UK. It's nowhere near as severe as other places in the world. But I was reminded of Chris Patten, so Lord Patten of Barnes, last governor of Hong Kong, former chancellor of Oxford University, senior civil servant, who was asked when on Radio 4 one time that was he reasonable despite being religiously observant. And I think many people who are religiously observant will have stories that they know like this, the kind of frames and stereotypes that exist about religious people, whether you're rational, reasonable, unreasonable, and the way that ideology actually hijacks your mind and makes you forget the people that you're actually in front of. You might well know they're reasonable. How could this have been said about a senior civil servant, you might wonder. And this polite persecution, of course, is nothing in comparison to the staggering 83% of the world's population that live in nations where religious freedom is threatened or banned. And I think the point I'd like to make, I guess, from a Catholic Christian religious perspective is that religion is serious business. Religion's reach globally is growing. And Europe is the exceptional case in this. Our views about religion and, isn't it nice, these lovely religious people, they can be entitled to have their kind of eccentric ideas, is not a global trend. Many of the world's largest non-governmental humanitarian actors are faith-based. 84% of the world's population is religious, and the absolute number is growing fast in critical areas such as Africa and Asia. I mean, compare this with UK data that says that 52% roughly of the public say they don't belong to any religion. The Anglican Communion has footprint in 165 countries. The Catholic Church, exists in more than 4,000 legal entities internationally. The global Sharia finance sector is worth 1.8 trillion. And even closer to home, Protestants and Catholics are highly represented in the Houses of Parliament, and it's becoming more religiously diverse. So religion is a diverse and something that's continuously evolving, but it's serious business. And I'm reminded of when Pope Benedict came to the UK for a state visit in 2010 and said something that should echo in our ears today, that religion is not a problem for legislators to solve, but a vital contributor to the national conversation. And so part of looking for what those dialogues between faith and reason looks like, is partly what we're exploring today. Does it just look like tolerance? I think tolerance is such a boring word. Who longs to be tolerated? And in Pope Francis, we see something more than tolerance, right? We see in his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti about the fraternity and how he's offered this in going to visit, like majority Muslim countries, making trips that no Pope has ever made before, this gesture of universal fraternity that goes beyond mere tolerance. Because when you go beyond tolerance into fraternity, you go beyond simplistic categories and solutions. And so as a Catholic informed by Catholic social teaching with its overriding concern for people's individual dignity, made in the image and likeness of God, you see a distinction not only for religious freedom, so to speak, so freedom of religion to be able to practice one's religious faith without incursion from the government, but also freedom of belief and conviction, because the social dynamic isn't just a freedom to practice, but we have to, if we want the fruits, we need the roots as well. So you think of religious schools and hospitals and charities, they should be able to live according to their convictions, their religious faith or non-religious convictions and belief. And I think this work of these organizations, often faith is not something you can compartmentalize, it's integral to their identity. And as Saqib was saying, and we've seen in the in the recent Truro report, these rights don't exist in isolation, or they're not pitted against each other, as is often done in the West, but these often are mutually implicative. They impact and they rest on one another, particularly abroad. And so my final thought really is to say if religion is serious business, we almost need to treat it like a professional competence. The same way that economics is dealt with. I'm very encouraged by a friend of mine who's working with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office to put together a religion for international engagement module. The former ambassador to the Holy See, Sally Axworthy, used to say, she was recently sent on an economics course. And you think, what has diplomacy got to do with economics? Her boss said. And she thinks, well, it's kind of obvious. Who would say that now? And religion is the same. It's a serious, omnipresent geopolitical reality in the same way as law and economics. And I think we should start seeing religion into this. You wouldn't go into a country without looking at economic realities. And often religion isn't a side issue, it's often an integral issue. And these are important issues.
Thanks so much, Brenden, and thank you for all of those opening remarks, which I think really clearly set the current global picture when it comes to freedom of religion and belief. And this was touched on slightly already, but my first question is around the pandemic. And we've seen governments all over the world take very different responses to the COVID pandemic. But how has this impacted on religious freedom around the world? And how has it impacted on the ability to protect and advocate for religious freedoms? David, I don't know if you want to come this one first, because I know Open Doors have come out and said that some countries have actually exploited the pandemic to increase religious persecution.
They have. It's changed the nature of the persecution in many countries that we're working in. So we've seen discrimination in aid distribution in places like India and Myanmar, Nepal, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And it's changed the way already oppressive governments are able to further turn the screw on religious minorities, and particularly in relation to surveillance and censorship. And a big problem is misinformation, and we've got a whole focus on digital persecution at this moment in time. Often religious minorities have been demonized and accused of spreading the virus or being super spreaders or made scapegoats, and therefore COVID, the pandemic, has been used against them. It's also brought some religious leaders together as well on the ground to deal with problems in a very, very practical way. So, in our centers of hope in Syria, we do a lot of work just trying to rebuild people's lives and rehouse people and retrain people, and it's brought the communities together in a really positive way there. So it's a mixed picture, but generally it has exacerbated religious persecution on the ground, we found.
Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Uzma, I can see you nodding along with what David's saying.
Yes, thank you, David. We have very heart-touching stories from the lockdown time. We witnessed that faith leaders from Muslim majority in Pakistan reached to faith leaders from Hindu and Christian communities to share food bags and funds they get because of their influence, in community and on the government level to support the minorities. This is a sign that communities are saying to each other that we are here for each other. But on the other side, it is also very painful to hear every single time from faith leaders and as a result then from local communities that COVID is not real. World are showing fake deaths within the countries and around the world just to create hurdles in Ramzan gatherings, just to economically weaken the Muslim Ummah. And all these statements are the, for us as searchers, all these statements and the peace builders, these statements are the indicators which are urging for us to be think that why a whole community seeing even a world pandemic as conspiracy against their religion. The reaction we faced in pandemic, and the indicators we have from pandemic demand us to revise our strategy to protect and advocate for religious freedom and to promote the environment of trust where faith leaders trust the government and nation trust each other, so we can witness the real community resilience.
Brenden, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, so thinking about how the pandemic has impacted religious freedom, I think there's certainly a new tension that has arisen, but also potentially an opportunity. I think the tension is, you could always ask hypothetical questions about what happens to certain seemingly inalienable rights when they're actually tested. So I was interested recently to read the government's Freedom of Religion and Belief Toolkit. Now, word of warning, like, it's easy for me to say this, not as a legislator or as an MP. So, and so I am conscious that there are, kind of difficult decisions to make, but certainly the tension I noticed in that is that one of the things, and this is published in 2016, so before the pandemic, is saying that the freedom of religion, which it enshrines as assured under international human rights and in the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it says that it's a right that cannot be derogated from, even in times of public emergency. And so I mean, we see, in a sense, that's the real practical impact of what happens to these inalienable rights. We say this, and there's a lot of good talk, but the pandemic has tested our resolve in this matter. I'm not saying the decisions are easy in that, but certainly throughout the world, this has been an issue about the freedom of religious practice and the shutting down of services and public worship. So that's the one. There's clearly a tension there, and the other is, I think, what I've seen is an opportunity for solidarity. So I have noticed, in a sense, what was often the persecution, the thing that happens over there, I don't see it. There's a kind of solidarity, even if ours is in a more diminished form. I've noticed, in a sense, religious believers, but also people at large. It has created the opportunities for solidarity. No longer is, you kind of have the suffering, the persecution, the whatever that happens over here. And the pandemic has given a kind of common framework. So perhaps that's something to build on, that kind of solidarity, that liberty at home impinges and is affected by liberty abroad, and seeing those two things connected. So perhaps there's an opportunity for solidarity as a result, as well as the difficult legal tensions that have to be navigated or have been navigated because of the pandemic.
Saqib, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, just a reflection, really. I mean, I often worry about the opportunity that insularity as a result of COVID will present to countries who do, historically persecute religious minorities. And I suspect there will be many stories that we haven't even heard of yet, that, when we review and we'll hear about what's been going on. And my other worry is that once those bad practices or those contraventions of human rights exist, they're very hard to root out because they become a part of the fabric of the way of doing things. But I mean, Brendan's right. There was also an opportunity where communities internationally work together. So I saw reports during the first lockdown, I think, where members of the Sikh community were exporting aid and working together. So we had lots of great community volunteerism happening here domestically, but also internationally. And that really speaks to the idea, I think, that actually having strong avenues of interfaith work across the world, having dialogue, obviously play a really significant role. And of course, I have to commend Open Doors for the work that they do for highlighting where these issues exist and bringing wider society into the frame, and of course other groups that also do similar work, because actually what it does is it means that it keeps those issues in the forefront of legislators' minds, but also in the public's mind, and also creates the pressure and the desire to do stuff internationally. And I guess fundamentally we are a very compassionate society. We are our own biggest critics, and dare I say it, you go on Twitter, you'll find a completely different analysis to the one I just gave. But actually, the reality is there is a desire to do positive work, and you see this across all age categories and across many communities. And you see this when, of course, reports do come out of contraventions of human rights, how people react to that. So I'm positive about what we can do, but I worry about what has happened and what we will hear about in the coming months and years.
Fleur, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Libby. Just briefly, a couple of other thoughts and very helpful contributions. I think there's so many different ways in which COVID has impacted all of our lives, and it's the same for freedom of religious belief and the amount of persecution. But I think there's one aspect which is our practicing of religion, and I'm a woman of faith myself, and our being able to go to church on that regular basis has been postponed or fractured in a way. So what will happen to everyone's practicing of their religious belief after this time? We don't know yet what that is, and the strength that we'll all have in our church communities and how we're going to be different afterwards. And I think that's an impact that has been there as well that we're yet to see. And I know there are lots of concerns by faith leaders and people who are practicing their faith about what they will see that's after at the end of it when we can go back and practice. So that's one. I think it's been shown in reports that there has been an increase in state-sponsored discrimination using COVID as a one way of increasing the amount of guidelines and actual legislation against religious minorities. And also within that, blaming ethnic minorities and religious minorities, this climate of fear that there has been, it's kind of been more not allowed, but more possible for people to be blamed for aspects of COVID, even because of that, just not knowing what's going on, especially at the beginning. We didn't know where this was coming from, what the impact would be and what we were going to do. And so that raised the amount of discrimination, and that's still there. The effects of that are still there and going to take a long time to counter and bring communities back together. And my final point would be about the aid and how we deliver aid, because I think there have been aid cuts, so in the UK, but in other places as well. So for the joining up of the Foreign Office and DFID with the new FCDO, we don't yet know all of the effects that there's going to be, but we know that there are aid cuts coming, and a lot of them will be those smaller organisations, and many of them will be the religious organisations who are, in many areas of the world, the strongest social services actually delivering health and education to people. So the impact that will have of more sort of bigger UN aid projects being funded rather than smaller, more grassroots projects being funded, that is going to have an impact as well on the religious aspect of the development agenda.
Thanks, Fleur. I can see that we have a lot of audience questions coming in, so I'll head over to those. Our first comes from Daniel Wheatley, who Daniel is the Senior Diplomatic Officer for the Bahrain community in the UK. And I think Daniel's also going to offer some reflections alongside his question. So Daniel, over to you.
Well, firstly, if I could just thank Mr. Bhatti for his kind reference to the concerns of the Baha'i community, but I would very much align myself also with Ms. Anderson's comments that all party groups serve a great value. The point that was made about the COVID crisis, and David will know Open Doors, I think, contributed towards a report of the all-party group on international religious freedom, further supporting what Ms. Anderson has shared. And we are a group of Baha'is, Muslims, Christians, and also indeed atheists. And what that report found, chaired by Jim Shannon MP, was that governments all around the world are using the COVID crisis to expand the pressure on religious communities, and also communities that are secular and do not, wish to exercise their rights not to believe. The Baha'i community has, of course, specific concerns in Iran, and one of those things is the rise of hate speech, where state media can be used to isolate and incite hatred against a minority. But of course, and alas, it is not just something that occurs in lands outside of the United Kingdom. If we follow the reports on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, we know that Muslim and Jewish communities in the United Kingdom and in other places can also face conspiracy theories. And I think, Uzma, you mentioned this in your comments, which I very, very much welcomed. It is when we work together. I've been very pleased to attend today and hear from you, learned colleagues, about this. And I would say that, through parliamentary devices and through all party groups and coalitions of faith communities, we are seeking to work with others. We're a small community, but we very much value the opportunity to learn from others and to share a path, because freedom of religion and belief does need to be a higher priority. The Bishop of Truro's report has pushed it up higher, and it is indeed members such as Mr. Bhatti and Ms. Anderson who are driving that forward. And I would just like to say how valuable that is and commend your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Next up, we have Hadi Pir, who similarly will offer some reflections alongside their question, as Hadi is the Vice President of YASDA, which, for those who don't know, is a global organisation established to support the Yazidi population, especially in northern Iraq. So, Hadi, it's a pleasure to have you join us. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Again, I listened to your speakers and your contributors, and I pretty much, align with everything they said. But if we are speaking on the topic of COVID-19 and how that affected the religious freedom, I think in Iraq, we were fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. We were fortunate there were no specific things that they were against the Yazidis. You can say that but the other thing that we were unfortunate because that affected them in some other ways. For example, there was restriction on movement, and most of the Yazidis who went back to their homes in Sinjar, they were not, because there were lack of services, they were not able to travel to other areas to get those things they needed. But also because of the everything is going on in Iraq when it comes to corruption, security issues, militias, and everything else. That also affected them to get the things they need, and whether vaccines or services. But I think one of the things that it affected them, that it's because of the pandemic, and most of the countries restricted funding, funding, especially to minorities in places where Yazidis are. And we saw a severe need of services, and lack of services, severe need for support, and the Iraqi government was not doing, or could not replace those needs, and that affected them. I mean, in a very, you can say, severe way, that affected severe. And this is one of the concerns that we raised to many countries, and this, like I said, but I think we were fortunate that during this pandemic, that there were no any more restrictions on religious freedom when it comes to Yazidis. And the new prime minister is very open, and he receives Yazidis many times. He listened to their concerns, but unfortunately, because of everything Iraq is going through, that the COVID-19 affected them probably more than other Iraqis, and certainly more than other people around the world.
Thanks, Hadi. We now have a question from Sam Rushworth, who works with the APPG on prevention on genocide. So Sam, over to you.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now,
yes,
Sam.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I just put my question in the chat, but I was just wondering really what the panel's views are on how can the UK maintain an influence in the world while it's cutting aid, because it seems to me that the gap between rhetoric and reality has never been wider. That the government is doing all sorts of things, including appointing a very powerful special envoy on freedom of religion or belief, and yet all over the world, projects that the UK used to fund are seeing their funding abruptly stopped, impacting on women and girls, impacting on projects that are designed to help combat identity-based violence. So I'd be interested just to hear the panel's views on that particular issue. I'd particularly be interested to hear from Saqib, because I did hear your speech in Parliament last week.
Thanks, Sam. Saqib, do you want to come in on that one first then? And then Fleur, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Libby. I mean, look, Samuel, it was, well, thanks for being the one person who listened to my speech, apart from the members of Parliament. But I'll just say, on a serious note, look, the international aid question was an incredibly challenging one for me personally. For me, I think it was important that whatever the cut is, it is temporary, and we regain our platform, delivering the 0.7% of GDP. Truthfully, I actually question the use of a percentage when it comes to international aid, because when we are having, where we've been through COVID and we've suffered great, economic problems, I'll frame it as that. Your GDP drops, and yet the need for aid is as important as it ever has been. So, I think there is probably a much broader debate on how we do international aid. But I think the crux of your question, I think, goes back to the last one as well, about COVID and how it's impacted. There is, we will have to be as strong as ever when it comes to our soft power. And part of that, of course, is our diplomatic channels. We have an excellent foreign service and a foreign office, and I think the integration of DFID with the FCO should be a positive, and I hope it will be, and that's what I will work in Parliament to do, to make it a positive and make it a stronger, so that we can be critical friends where we need to be, and we can be strong arbiters of the implementation of good, moral values where possible. But we've also, I think there's a new form of aid, so to speak, that I think it will play a really important role. And of course, that is the rollout of the vaccine. And I mentioned this in my speech last week, but I think in the much more short to medium term, what will be really, really important is, partly from a selfish point of view, of course, because we talk about it's not over till everyone's vaccinated. Of course, that's really important. But I think where we as a nation came up with one of the vaccines, the AstraZeneca one, and we distributed it at cost, I think that was a really good example of where we see ourselves as a country on the world stage, at helping other countries to address one of the biggest problems of our time. And I think that will be a really, really important tool in our arsenal as we go forward. Along with international aid, of course, there will be other things I think we can do, which is, for example, encouraging investment in other countries, presenting opportunities. Using the trade agenda actually is another opportunity where I know DIT have opened up on a consultation on it in terms of allowing for or working with third world countries, so to speak, and to allow them to open up their supply chains and things. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to do so. But fundamentally, Samuel, I will say this: that I am certainly someone who advocates us returning to the 0.7%.
Fleur, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I was in that debate as well, so maybe one other person heard me as well. It was a very, very powerful debate, and I think because at heart of it was this consensus that had been won over many decades of campaigning by people, was the 0.7% consensus, which does go up when times are good and down when times are bad, but at least keeps us on a figure that we had all agreed as a country. And then to break with that was very beyond disappointing. I hope Saqib's right, and I hope it's temporary, but I think it's going to mean that MPs like you, Saqib, just keep on reminding the government of that was the premise of which I know that many Conservative MPs voted for that. So it has to be there, but I don't know how the fiscal rules will change so much to return our aid levels. So it's a really, really concerning. It does undermine our soft power around the world. It undermines our climate arguments when we're about to host COP26 and we cut climate projects. It undermines what the issue under discussion today of talking about religious freedom on one hand, and yet cutting projects run by religious organisations. On the other hand, it does undermine that, and so we're going to have to work twice as hard to keep our position as global Britain. But also this, what I mentioned before about using many more multilateral funders, is really going to undermine smaller organisations that we have such an expertise in, that DFID had built up for a long time, real knowledge of what was going on the grounds. I mean, I've been a critic of DFID many times in my time. However, there were many strengths which are now under jeopardy of cutting, for example, 80% of water and sanitation projects, all of our South Sudan peace project as well. All of these things are not going to help religious freedoms and countering persecution on the ground in those areas. And the trade agenda was then one test of, okay, so will we actually build this into other ways of working? And the genocide agenda was not supported. The genocide amendment was not supported. So that was very disappointing as well. So there are lots of trade agreements that Saqib, you've mentioned, coming up. And so we'll have to see, will we be true to our word? What will we do? And we can build that. We can build in a different way of working. We can build in being true to our values, to those trade agendas, but it's going to take a lot of courage to do that.
Thanks, Blair. Our next question comes in from Kate Eastmond from CAFOD, who asks, in a society that prides itself on the advancements of women, how does the UK reconcile the approach being taken in a number of countries banning the hijab from the workplace? Isn't this only going to marginalise Muslim women further? Who'd like to come in on that one? Saqib.
Thanks, and it's a great question. I should just declare, I mean, I was a Brexiteer, and I led a national campaign group called Muslim for Britain, and this was one of the issues that came up during the campaign. We estimate we had about 800,000 British Muslims vote to leave, and without fail, every time I went into a mosque to speak to the congregation, of course I'd get mixed responses, but generally the women in the mosque would give their views of the experience that they've had in Europe, being headscarf wearing Muslim women. And what was of great concern to me at that point, the most senior advocate in the ECJ gave the opinion that actually it is possible to stop any person of faith. It's not just women who are wearing hijab, any person of faith to wear a religious symbol. So it could be a Christian with a cross, a Jewish person with a yarmulke, a Sikh person with a turban, and a Muslim woman with a hijab. And the justification, there was a line in there, if I remember correctly, basically alluding to the fact that actually it wasn't part of someone's identity. And therefore, as long as you were equally prescriptive in those measures, you could stop that from happening. The reality is, of course, that's just not possible. I mean, if you are a Sikh person who wears a turban, I can guarantee you that they will tell me that it's part of their identity. If it's a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, or a Christian person who wears a cross, by the way, this is an essential part of who they are as an individual. And then being told that you must hide that, to me, it's really at odds with certainly who we are as a nation. And the ECJ and the EU have taken the step now to say, to put that into law. And I'm very worried about that step, because actually I think it undermines religious communities within Europe, but actually also sends out a message that is okay to do. And I think this is, I can't remember the exact line that Brenden used from Pope Benedict, but it was, I think he really captured that sentiment that, religious communities are not something to be, certainly not something to be just tolerated, but they should be an asset and a friend to work with, really. And the final point, just to kind of underline all that, if you're in Europe right now, and you are a person of faith, someone who wears a turban, or a woman who wears a hijab, or a Jewish person with a yarmulke, or a Christian person with a cross, or whatever the religious symbol is. I mean, how do you feel right now if that is the most senior court or the most senior legislative body telling you that it is okay? Well, that is not part of your identity. It basically takes people out of the workforce, it disenfranchises them, and it undermines religious freedom and religious communities, in my view.
Thank you, Saqib. Well, I think that's all we're going to have time for. Thank you so much for all those questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to so many of them that came in. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our excellent panel, Uzma Hussain, Saqib Bhatti MP, Dr. David Landrum, Fleur Anderson MP, and Brenden Thompson. I do hope that you all enjoyed this virtual event today. It's a difficult and quite emotive topic, especially when we see so many examples of religious persecution around the world today. And so I'd like to thank our panelists and all those in the audience doing such amazing work on calling out religious persecution and promoting freedom of religion around the world. I'd also like to thank Layla, who organised today's event. The Coalition for Global Prosperity will be moving back to hosting in-person events after the summer break. So do keep an eye out on our website and our Twitter feed to hear more. And thanks again for tuning in. I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.